Welcome back to WCLD. This is My Generation. I hope you enjoyed that little montage of some of the more modern and maybe even edgy takes on Lewis Carroll's creations. Now, for the next 90 minutes or so, we are going to talk all about Lewis Carroll's continued influence on popular culture today. I wonder if that young man in Christchurch had any idea that 150 years later, we would be talking about his influence on, oh, I don't know, just off the top of my head, fashion, which is what Kira Vakovic is going to talk about in just a few moments, or say music, which is what Mike Batt is going to present to us, a little behind the music documentary of his Hunting of the Snark musical. Now, in terms of reimagining Lewis Carroll's works, I could not think of a better person to start the conversation than Christopher Myers. Chris is a multi-talented, multifaceted artist. He has done sculpture, shadow puppets, tapestries, short films. He's done theater, embroidery. I'm sure I'm forgetting some things. But most importantly, for our purposes today, he is an award-winning children's book illustrator. And in 2007, he reimagined Jabberwocky, the nonsense poem we all know and love, as a one-on-one basketball game between a young boy and a truly monstrous adversary. Now, Chris and I talked about so many things, but don't worry, you hardcore Carolians out there, I did ask him about the afterword that was included in Jabberwocky, something that a lot of Carolians found very clever, others not so much. So don't worry, I asked him all about it. Chris also talked about the importance of creating worlds and of retelling stories over and over again throughout the generations. And also, you know what? I'm going to let him tell it.
Hey all, I'm so glad to be speaking with a community of like-minded thinkers and readers and people who care about ideas. That is at the center of like my engagement with Lewis Carroll and with these texts. And I'm excited to think alongside y'all who are thinking about especially this man's work in a kind of such a holistic and interesting fashion. I'm recently doing a bunch of work about another set of Victorians, and in that work, I've kind of come to reevaluate some of my relationship to Lewis Carroll and to why I was inspired to think about Lewis Carroll for young people today. So I'm doing this work about a little girl that was gifted to Queen Victoria in 1850s, a little girl named Sarah Bonetta Forbes. And so she was given as a gift to Queen Victoria by King Gezo of Dahomey, to her envoy, a Captain Frederick Forbes, who was on the ship Bonetta. And as a 5-year-old girl, she's given away to Queen Victoria. And as you can imagine, the stories that come from this little weird moment took over the newspapers, took over the kind of cultural milieu of the time, and made me rethink Lewis Carroll and made me rethink the kind of world of stories from which Lewis Carroll was coming. Particularly, Lewis Carroll is thinking about the exploration of strange worlds. And that in and of itself has to do with the endless stream of stories that that he was receiving around colonialism, around traveling the world, around every kind of strange new land that people were experiencing. So, we're thinking about things like the Crystal Palace and the way that England at that time is a kind of crossroads of the world. Queen Victoria herself had like at least 3 wards from 2 from the subcontinent and 1 from Africa. And when you look at even like Lewis Carroll's later works, like Sylvie, you look at these kinds of things, and you see that there is a similar kind of thought about, what would food look like in this far off place? What would be the effects of you know, of the process of the process of traveling to these far off places. This invention of new lands has so much to do with the contemporary time. And I think especially now in this world of pandemic, in this world of us looking at each other over Zooms, um, we are kind of brought back to this moment and the importance of imagining what a far off place is, you know, where all of a sudden the places that seemed much closer, I'm currently in New York, I'm speaking to LA, these kinds of moments have become rarer and remind us what it is like, the amazingness of being able to imagine with a fullness and a sincerity what another world would be, what another world would be, what the mythologies of that other world would be. And I'm always interested in those kind of moments in which cultures touch. And Jabberwocky is one of those things in which, while it's absolutely a flight of fancy, absolutely like a sui generis moment of imagination, of great imagination, it's also in the mode of, it's thinking about the myth, the kind of this moment of like great mythology building, this moment of looking at the world in new eyes, with new eyes, that is super of his time, of Lewis Carroll's time. And I'm interested in all of those dynamics and how they sort of collide into each other, and how those modes of reception, those modes of telling stories and reporting stories, how all of them sort of form an organic base from which someone like Lewis Carroll like invents their world. And I'm so excited to watch as each subsequent generation learns the lessons of what it means to invent a world, more than it is, you know, this is why this work has a staying power, has its longevity, because every subsequent generation must learn to invent their world anew. And there is no kind of better teacher than Lewis Carroll in that.
So I am so curious about this work about Queen Victoria. I was not aware of this.
Mhm.
I know you're an artist in many mediums and many forms. Is this going to be a children's book or something else?
This is a show that will be opening in London on October 7th, on Cork Street. And it's a show of tapestries that I've been sewing for the last number of months. And as you can see from my process and from the ways in which I can parrot the ideas of research. I grew up as a history researcher. That was my summer job,
Wow.
was that when I was a kid, I did photo research and labor history research and kind of racial history research. That was my, and so I spent a lot of time in archives. I spent a lot of time kind of digging through dusty papers and these sorts of things. Amongst the things that I have in my own personal collection are a set of letters from this young woman, Sarah Bonetta Forbes, to her caretakers, mentioning her relationships with the Queen and this sorts of things. I think that the time period of Lewis Carroll has got to be one of the most, it's like a linchpin time period. It's like the hub of a wheel that extends to today. And I'm interested in all of the kind of ways in which the stories and the story structures of this time period affect our way of thinking today.
And since you are an artist of so many mediums, does it just jump out at you immediately how you want to approach a certain subject, like tapestries? Was
Oh,
that
I
immediate,
see.
like I'm going to do tapestries, or
I
did you think
see.
about I could do paintings, I could do a book?
Well, yeah, me, I do exactly. I tend to think about another reason I'm sure that I'm interested in Victorians is that you have all of these kind of polymaths, and I aspire toward that. You know, you have people who are like, I'm a mathematician, but I'm also a world-renowned writer, and I'm also this. I'm also an Anglican priest, that kind of thing, clergyman or whatever, and I too kind of aspire to that sort of polymathness, in that I also believe in telling and retelling stories. One of the things that I love about Lewis Carroll's work is that it is made for retelling. You know, there are so many versions. There's everything from Jan Svankmaker's, like the tech animators, really macabre stop motion, to Disney, to, you know, every kind of storytelling that plugs into this tradition of storytelling. And I believe sincerely that, number one, no story that's worth its salt is only told once. You know, stories are made to be repeated. They're made to be gifted to each other. It's part of one of the things I love about children's literature, is that it's one of the only communal literatures. It's like that and religious texts, you know, are the things that you read out loud to a community. You know, you read a children's book out to, you know, a classroom. You have conversations. You know, when we read adult novels, we read them to ourselves, you know, ideally in an overstuffed chair with a dim light. But, you know, books for young people are made to be inherited by a community. And that sense of who that community is, that's exciting for me to kind of engage in that sort of storytelling. So every time I want to tell a story, I think about both the different ways I could tell it. So I think about, you know, would I want to make this a theater piece? Would I want to make this a set of tapestries? Would I want to make this a book for young people, or a short film, or whatever like that? And then I also think about how have these stories been told before? Because I really sincerely believe that there's very little that's new under the sun. We are always in a tradition of storytelling, and I'm very excited to name myself as being part of that tradition. Yeah.
That's an excellent point about children's books. Yeah, they're a community thing. And you're right. Yeah, adult books you read by yourself. Maybe the ladies break open some Chardonnay and have a book club or something. But yeah, normally it's
Right.
a solo experience, whereas the
Right.
children's books are meant to be told over and over again.
Yeah, yeah.
And this bridging worlds that you're speaking of, and I'm getting out your book here, my copy.
Please.
Which obviously you bridged a few worlds in your retelling of Jabberwocky as a one-on-one basketball game. So when did you first have this idea? Was it a long time ago? Was it as an adult?
It was definitely as an adult. I was interested in, to be very honest, you know, oftentimes when people think about questions that are au courant, like things like, you know, multiculturalism in literature and these sorts of things, they always put these things in oppositional terms. They always want to say, we should have this book and that will replace that book. And as someone who loves literature, as someone who loves books, I don't ever see them as oppositional. I don't ever see, I always saw myself, especially in certain writers, Lewis Carroll being one of them. You know, I mean, I was a little brown boy growing up in New York City, but I saw myself in those stories. And I think that that's part of the kind of testament to the stories. And I think it's a testament to the longevity of these stories, that there are so many of us in the world who still see ourselves in these stories. And I wanted to make it clear that my interest in these stories was not somehow oppositional to my experience as a young Black boy growing up in New York. You know, that my excitement about the Jabberwock was, I had analogs to battle in my life. And one of those analogs was one-on-one on a basketball court. There were people that I've had to, you know, there were dragons to be slain, so to speak.
Yeah, it's definitely part of the magic, I think, that everyone can see themselves falling down there. I like to think it's a constant stream of people falling down rabbit holes and just going through the
Right.
same
I mean,
cycle.
and this also is a testament to, like, what makes good literature is that it touches you on lots of levels. And you know, the kind of more flat the literature is, the less that it relates to kind of the broad spectrum of humanity. But for anyone who's reading, you know, Lewis Carroll, you understand that it has such depth that you can plug in on some level on all the ways. You know, the moments of unsurety and unknownness, I think are relatable to everyone, especially young folks. And I think that especially in this time in which everyone wants to pretend to be sure about everything. That's one of the problems of like our media and of our culture right now, is that we've lost the truth that lays in the idea of unsurety, the truth that lays in the idea of mystery, of confusion. You know, that is, if there's anything that is essentially human, it's that we're all walking around a little confused. and I love that as a kind of a central tenet of Lewis Carroll, you know. But this idea that stories are meant to be retold, I think that this is the history nerd and research nerd in me. I'm interested in the kind of you know, the copyright law at this time is really loose and really problematic. You know, Dickens is coming to the United States and like confiscating people who are bootlegging his book, confiscating bootleg copies of his books. You know, this is the copyright law is really loose at this time, and there are constantly additions being made. And there's, on one hand, I'm a big advocate of copyright law. It's how I make my living. Not copyright law itself, but just the fact that you can't just go around just bootlegging my books. That's very useful for me and my family. However, you know, there is something that you understand, that someone writing at this time knows that this book is going to be circulated. Another odd thing, and this also relates to Lewis Carroll, in this work that I'm doing currently about this little girl, is that I realized that so many of her letters, she wrote these letters, they're handwritten, they're these like kind of exquisite objects, because she writes across herself. I don't know if you've seen some Victorian letters. They write one direction on the paper and then they write the other direction on the paper, perpendicular, so as to save paper. It makes reading the things darn near impossible.
Yeah.
That being said, you realize that like even correspondence, and I know that Lewis Carroll was an inveterate corresponder. They say that he received and sent somewhere between, like all combined, somewhere like 98,000 letters or something like this.
And cataloged them all, like he had an early version of Excel by hand. Yeah.
You know, but oftentimes letters would be circulated. Even you know, just the idea of writing then wasn't necessarily so personal. So even like personal letters would go on to someone else. And that's what happens with this little girl. Her letters is that she writes a letter and she has the understanding that they will be sent on to a few other people who need news about her.
Oh, wow.
And it changes your perspective on what it is to that the act of writing itself is an act of sharing, and that's implied in the work. You know, that there is something community based in what Lewis Carroll's doing, and it's very exciting.
That's fascinating, and I'm enjoying listening to you so much. I don't want to interrupt, but I didn't know that about Dickens. I love the thought of him coming to America and tracking down people. I'm hoping he was wearing a top hat at the time, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, right. I mean, Dickens is also fascinating for a number of reasons, including this kind of like, you know, early conflicts with copyright law. There's also one of the reasons I'm interested in Dickens currently. And again, this talks about the ways in which literature at this time, there's an intersection between everything from like kind of anthropological notes to fiction. So there's a dancer that Dickens describes in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, in the Five Corners area, in Dickens' book American Notes, named Juba. And that dancer then goes on to make a whole career for himself in England as Boz's Juba. You know, Dickens had a nickname of Boz.
Wow.
And as Boz's Juba. And you see there's this kind of intersection between what it means to write, to transmit stories, and the fact that someone would then read that story and then kind of investigate it further, want to see what is the real life that it is based on. There is this voracious appetite for the world that's happening in Victorian England. There's a kind of an appetite to understand one's place in a kind of a global scheme. You see that even in terms of the domestic goods. So, you know, when you think about the idea of all the things that we think of as being very English, tea, or, you know, these are colonial products that, you know, that you know, you see when you see or soap. Soap is another one. When you look at Sunlight soap is one of the first big international vegetable-based soaps. Stop me if this is boring, but
I'm learning so much. No,
okay,
please.
so Sunlight soap, one of the first international vegetable-based soaps. It's based on palm oil in West Africa. William Lever gets all these palm oil plantations. He partners with the Belgian government, gets these palm oil plantations in West Africa, and is able to kind of become a soap magnate, because the earlier ways of making soap are from rendered animals, right? So like the animal fat soap, and that's like a nasty process. Palm oil is infinitely better. And is also used to lubricate all the kind of machinery of the Industrial Revolution. But here you are, if you're like a kid, you know, bathing in Victorian England, and you've got this soap, you have an understanding that this has a relationship to West Africa, that your tea has a relationship to India, that this is a world that is voracious for contact with the world. And that is super evidence in our guy, in Lewis Carroll, that there's a voracious kind of contact with the world that you're seeing in the work.
And I think the most clear example of that, I always think, is the hookah, right? Because
absolutely,
goods from India were just all the rage at that point.
Absolutely. I mean, and you even see it, the most kind of the flattest but funnest example of this kind of voracious appetite for the world, I think, is in our guy's contemporary Edward Lear, where you see it's just a geographical doggerel, right? It's like there once was a man from India, there once was a man from Tibet, there once was a man from, and it's just the idea that there should be people from all these places, you know.
Right.
And I think that is that sort of world building, and that world building as a mode of thinking is so exciting, to understand that it's not simply about the kind of colonial relations or this sort of thing. There's a mindset of a hungriness to build worlds and to understand the worlds that we live in, and that's something that's central to our guy.
Absolutely. I want to make sure I get to some questions. I sent out a call to our social media, and honestly, it was pretty much the same two questions over and over again, which number one was, how about some more? Basically, not much a question, but like, have you considered any other Lewis Carroll's other poems, illustrating them? I mean, I know you've done E.E. Cummings, right? And you've done the Old Testament stories, but is there any other classic literature? And of course, this group is most interested in, maybe say, Walrus and Carpenter, or how about The Aged Man is Sitting on the Gate? Like, do you have any visions for those that you would ever consider?
Number one, as I would love to, I think yes is the answer. I'm open to suggestions, and I would love you guys' understanding to kind of back me up, you know, and at this point. That would be so good to kind of be pointed in some direction. I love, as you can see, I love thinking history. I love thinking about historical modes of storytelling, and your information and your kind of passionate involvement in the literature would be a great compass for me to follow. And I'm super down. I would love to think about that together. So yeah. So absolutely, more is on the way and can be on the way. I have an imprint at Random House that I run, and then I'm still publishing my own books, as well as about 15 other kinds of formats of storytelling and making. So and as I said, you know, when I'll tell you the other kind of impulse behind making that book in the first place was to say, hey, this is my lineage. My lineage is Lewis Carroll. My lineage is E. Cummings. My lineage is Zora Neale Hurston. I'm interested in all of these kind of writers, and I absolutely I would be interested in kind of continuing that sort of exploration of my own storytelling lineage. Yeah.
Oh, careful what you wish for. I have a feeling you're going to get a lot of suggestions.
I would love it. I would love it.
Excellent. And actually, my own question, do you remember how old you were when you first read the Alice books?
Oh God, no, absolutely not. I mean,
Were
I
you a
grew up
kid?
yeah, you're absolutely a child.
Okay.
I grew up in a very bookish household, and which is why, my father was a writer, Walter Dean Myers, and so I grew up with books as my best friend. I was that kid. At one point, I was with my mother and a friend of mine, and my friend said, Chris says he didn't really have any friends till he was like 14. Is that true? My mother says, yes, absolutely. He had no friends. He was friendless. And so, but I did have books. So I cannot remember my first exposure to Lewis Carroll. I do remember copying illustrations from Tenniel. I remember that, like when I was like learning to draw.
Oh, wow.
I remember learning about engraving then, and that sort of thing. I do think that in the DNA of our storytelling, especially our storytelling for young people, Lewis Carroll is one of the strands of the double helix. And I think that you can see and you can recognize Lewis Carroll in all these other forms around us. Yeah.
And then the other question, this is from some hardcore Carolians, but
we like hardcore.
Yes, the afterword of the book. Now, for those of you who don't know, Chris had some fun, right? All for funsies.
Absolutely.
Yes, and said that he found some references to basketball, or the forerunner to basketball in Lewis Carroll's diaries in the margins, and that's so basically you cracked the code, right? This is what he really meant.
Yes, I Dan Browned it, as they say. Well, one of the things, and I don't know if you guys have felt this over the past, because I grew up researching. I grew up, as a researcher. Have we all noticed that research skills have just stopped? I mean, we see this with COVID, I think, absolutely. But the amount of folks in the world who are like, I did my research, and what they mean is that they Googled something.
Yep.
What yep. They mean is that they too have the same search engine that everyone else has. And I think that in the spirit of fun and in the kind of a lightness, and also in the spirit of, I'm interested in how everyone wants to legitimate what they have to say all the time nowadays with their research.
Right.
I wrote this note, and what the most comical part of the note is not the kind of deft and quick response of the Lewis Carroll Society. I'll tell you the most comical part of that note was that the reviewers in the New York Times did not pick up on my humor.
See, yeah, you would have gotten away with this. No one would have paid attention at all. I couldn't believe that.
Exactly. And you would, and this idea that that was for me the funniest thing. I thought that what I was doing was absolutely out of the box, and people would understand that I was playing. But this is the state of affairs. This kind of presaged where we're at now, where everyone in the world says that they're doing research, and I'm still to this day like tickled by the idea of everyone's doing research, but nobody has a library card. I'm like, how are you doing research? And what pray tell did you? I don't. Yes.
Right. And also, the supposed research is pretty much always just to support the viewpoint you already have, right? You're not looking for something to change your mind.
Of course, you wouldn't want another point of view to kind of interrupt the thrust of your heart and your head. And so, yeah, I absolutely was having fun and was surprised as heck when people didn't understand that I was having fun.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize that that the kind of the format of especially I think as a guy, a man saying that they've done research had such weight. Nobody knew. And if I had known that when I was even more young, I've caused more trouble.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know.
Yeah, and I mean, I was pretty certain you weren't doing an Andy Kaufman-esque, ooh, they're not going to know if this is real or not, right?
No,
No, you were just,
absolutely not.
yeah,
As someone who's pored over enough manuscripts and looked in margins of enough pages, um, I thought almost immediately everyone would know that, you know, that's not how research happens. Nobody finds a secret, you know, especially not from like classic texts. You know, there's not a lot of secret portals into the author's mind that no one has ever thought of.
right.
You know, I
Yes.
mean, it's like I had said that I found like an undiscovered James Joyce text or something like this. This is so odd, but I also I enjoy the chaos. I think that too is very part of the Lewis Carroll legacy, is to a little bit enjoy the chaos.
Yes, and actually, maybe I should post on our social media, or maybe as part of this meeting, the New York Times book review, and then a member of our society wrote a letter saying, "Hey, wait a minute, this isn't right." And then your response, I enjoyed very much, about the, Victorian ladies with parasols stalking you at your local bodega and stuff.
Yes.
It's a hilarious response. So very worth reading all that. My favorite part of the afterword, and I don't know if it was intentional or just a very happy accident,
Mhm.
but just the whole finding it in the margins kind of thing, because Lewis Carroll, of course, wrote copious diaries, and the most famous diary entry ever was actually very incomplete when he first talks about well, the boat ride that he first told Alice's Adventures Underground to the girls. Like the very first time he told it, his actual diary entry is just basically, yeah, I took the girls out for a nice ride today. It was great. And then months later, not exactly in the margins, but on the opposite page, it's like, oh, by the way, that's when I told the story for the first time. So again, I don't know if that was intentional on your part, but I thought that was hilarious. Yeah.
Absolutely. And yet there's also, I also, one of the things that's interesting to me about Lewis Carroll, and this talks about this idea of like Victorian letter writing, Victorian writing in general, is that there is a sense that Lewis Carroll is always writing to a public, right? And I think that that's one of the things, one of my like side interests in this world is to dispel the myth of writer for young people. Recently, a number of years back, this is before the pandemic, I went to a school in Brooklyn for continuing learners, kids who had dropped out of high school and came back. And the kid looked at me and he said, "Man, you don't look like a writer. You look like some guy who lives on my block." And I told him, I was like, then I'm doing my job. Then you should know that like all writers are people like us. All writers are people who want to be remembered well, who are busily crafting our own stories. And I can imagine after the first kind of inklings that Alice was a hit, Lewis Carroll going back to his diary, be like, "Oh, and this was the moment. This is when the genius happened."
Oh, by the
And
way, yeah.
right, and I love the kind of ways that we edit and re-edit our lives, and I think that too can be a lesson for especially young folks. Yeah.